swamps where cedars grow, and turtles wait on logs, but not for anything in particular. Fields bordered by crooked fences, broken by years of standing still. Orchards so old they have forgotten where the farmhouse is. Well, hello to you both, and welcome to New Musical Chairs, a post-punk podcast. Once again, I am your host, Jay Cridford, and this episode is episode 4 on the agenda. Tonight is one of my favourite bands, and my guest is one of my favourite lyricists. This band formed in 1979 in rural Worcestershire here in England, and continued to thrive in the post-punk underground, releasing records to this day. Despite a shared ideology with contemporaries like Gang of Four or Joy Division, their countryside upbringing set them apart. What started as a hindrance to their progress soon became the catalyst for a unique sound that's theirs and theirs alone. They've experimented with Americana and Jazz Age in the 90s, not wanting to be trapped by the pastoral, romantic image they cultivated. The 2000s became something of a rebirth for the band, and they've since found a way of blending the rural and the urban. 40 years later, and with a career-spanning documentary on the way, it's my pleasure to welcome Simon Jones from And Also the Trees. Simon, how are you?
Actually, I'm just recovering from a flu, but I'm okay.
Oh, gosh, I'm sorry to hear that.
It felt exactly like COVID, but I did a test and it came negative. So whether it's a new kind of COVID or just a flu, I don't know. But anyway, it's on the way out now, thank God.
Oh, thank goodness for that. I'm really pleased to hear that. You're in Switzerland, aren't you, these days?
That's right, yeah.
So I don't know what kind of weather you've had over there this summer, but it's been one of the wettest and clammiest summers I can remember here.
It's been hot here, and today it's blowing an absolute gale, which is a bit weird for the time of year, but there we are.
Yes, it's been pretty windy here too. It's been pouring with rain here for probably the last 2 or 3 weeks solidly, to be honest with you. And when you live in the middle of nowhere in Yorkshire, that's less than ideal.
No, it's a shame, isn't it?
It is, yeah. But we muddle through, don't we? Make the best of it. And with that, thank you for joining me on the podcast. It's a bit of a strange one, this, actually, because And Also the Trees have been one of my absolute favourite bands for the last 15, 16 years. I discovered you guys are kind of just after my initial period of discovery with post-punk and kind of early gothic music. I was a teenager when a lot of the reissues were starting to come out, and actually it was your anthology was the first thing I bought, and I really strongly identified with it because I grew up in a similar environment to you, and it kind of proved that combining what was considered to be, I guess, an urban type of music with a rural kind of influence was possible. I don't know how you feel about the term post-punk today. I'm already beginning to find it a bit limiting.
It's for us, it's really useful, actually, because we've never been able to categorize ourselves. People have tried to call us, people have called us a gothic band, and okay, you can see there's some gothic influences, but when you look at the actual gothic music scene, I don't think it's really got much to do with us. Unless, of course, you bring in people like Nick Cave, I suppose, and Tindersticks. If people call them gothic, then okay. But it's never been a happy fit for us, or a comfortable fit.
Sure.
So when people started talking about post-punk, we thought, well, actually, that is exactly what we are. We formed as a punk band when we were very young. And before we actually learned to play our instruments adequately, the punk movement had moved on or died. We were left as a sort of a very young band with the desire to play and to create music, but no real scene. So we had this blank canvas in front of us of we could do what we wanted to. We could take music from whatever period or just experiment as we were sort of learning to play. So we were exactly post-punk.
It's interesting because I was talking to Charles Hayward from This Heat last month about this, and we kind of arrived in a position that I really liked, actually, was that the grassroots ideal of punk, that you could go out, buy instruments, potentially make a record, play some shows, worked as a sort of springboard into something else that was in many ways completely away from that, completely away from just guitar, bass, drums, four chords, and that it kind of opened out this residual energy to draw influence from other kind of non-Western, non-rock styles. And I think that's a really good... If that's what post-punk is, I'm all for it, I think.
Exactly. We even went out with flyers once, I remember, and on the flyers we had ourselves described as a new wave psychedelic band, which is, of course, kind of weird because we didn't know what to call ourselves.
Sure.
But now we don't mind this umbrella of post-punk. It's all right.
It is, yeah. And I think it's an interesting one because I've got this theory that all Gothic music is post-punk, but not all post-punk music is Gothic. And I think post-punk in that regard allows itself to be a broader church in terms of what's encompassed under it.
Yeah, exactly. If this heat are post-punk, then that's another end of the scale, you see. And you've also got bands like the Young Gods that are also post-punk, and you've got Mark Ullman, who you could almost say is post-punk as well. And it's really so broad. It's quite convenient.
Sure, yeah. And actually, I think this conversation might have brought me round to it again. But it's funny. When I was talking to Charles from This Heat, he kind of said that the big reason, obviously, with hindsight, was when they were around, even though they weren't really anything to do with the post-punk kind of scene or movement, if such a thing existed. But anyway, I was kind of thinking how I can do this because you've spoken at length in your fantastic articles you've written for the And Also the Trees website. I'll link those in the description of this. And if you are a fan of the band, you do yourself a service to go and read those because they're brilliant. I'd like to touch on the early years, but I think recently your recent work has kind of seen you go into some interesting new areas, and I thought it'd be quite a fun diversion to focus on the more recent period. And also obviously talk about upcoming projects as well, because there's a lot of stuff going on at the moment, and I think that's important.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, the things that I've been writing, it started off as just a fairly spontaneous idea to celebrate or commemorate or mark our 40th anniversary. I just said to Justin, shall I just write something about the very beginning of the band and stick it up on Facebook? And he said, yeah, why not? So, it took me 10 minutes. I wrote something and put it up, and people liked it. And then I did another one, and it wasn't really, I didn't think too much about it, but it's kind of snowballed, and people like it a lot. And the more people like it, the more I think, well, I should try a little bit harder to write it better. And I think I've got better at doing that, but of course that takes longer. And now I've got to part 27 or whatever it is, and we're only just halfway through 1984. So it's fascinating for me to go back and read my old notebooks. I've been working on the next one today, actually, and it's kind of so much was going on that I'd forgotten about, including the way we felt about things.
Right.
But yes, it's very good to get away from all that and think about and talk about what we're doing now, because
Definitely.
that's relevant now. What I'm talking about seems like really ancient history.
Yeah, of course. Now, obviously, it's an important ancient history, but my favourite record of yours is actually Hunter Not the Hunted, which came out in 2012. Probably closely followed by Born Into the Waves, which was 2016. But to be honest with you, I'd probably put the modern era of the band as my favourite period.
Me too. I mean, I suppose it's normal for an artist to say that, but I really feel that. I mean, having said that, I was surprised at how I liked, actually, the first album when I listened to it again recently. For the first time in years and years, properly. It's much better than I thought it was. But having said that, I'm very happy to talk about what we're doing now, because I think we are a rare example of a band that maybe if we haven't got better, although I think we have, we are at least not repeating ourselves too much and going backwards. I feel very confident about that.
Absolutely, and obviously there's been a lot of activity since the 40th anniversary milestone. There's the new record, The Bone Carver, which came out last year. There's the documentary, the upcoming career-spanning documentary in collaboration with FD Films, which we'll talk about. But just to go back to that period and these articles that you've been writing for a moment, as you've been writing those, you mentioned that you kind of reading your diaries, you were surprised by a few things. Was there any of this that did feel new to you? Perhaps kind of reading those diaries stirred up something that then clicked off something in your mind that took you down an avenue that you'd forgotten about or couldn't remember?
Creatively, no, but from a memory point of view, yes, certainly. I mean, I'm just reading my notebooks of the time when we'd just done our John Peel session and toured with The Cure for the second time, and I'm really surprised at how we all felt at the end of that. We felt not euphoric that we'd had the success that looks like on paper. We all felt very despondent.
Yeah.
And I think we felt that nothing had really changed.
Right.
We'd released our first single, we'd released our first album, we'd toured with The Cure a second time, but we weren't getting any coverage or very little coverage in the music press.
Right.
Which to us at that time was very important.
Of course,
it's
yeah.
difficult for people to imagine now how important the music press was, because now it doesn't really exist in the way that it used to with Sounds and Melody Maker and New Musical Express, which were the world to us. At the time, we weren't well reviewed, and there was very little coverage about the Trees. We didn't know why. We understand it more now. Now we know a little bit more about the music business, but I think we felt despondent. We thought that we'd been criticised. Our live shows had been quite brutally criticised a few times. It was damaging for us as the young guys with fragile egos, and there was no money coming in whatsoever. And we'd given up our jobs for this, and for the group, and we were on the verge of calling it a day, which is surprising. I had forgotten all about that. I just remembered the good times, and then releasing Virus Meadow, and then going abroad. But at that time, it was a very critical moment for us because we'd written our first album, and I wasn't a lyricist. Basically, I had to become a lyricist, and I didn't know if I was capable of doing that. I didn't know what I was going to write about. I didn't know if I could even write anything. And we hadn't really formed our own style. So it was a very sensitive and fragile period then. And I'd forgotten about that. And I suppose I'm talking too much about it now, but it's because of what I've been reading the last couple of days, actually, for this next entry that I write.
That's really interesting, isn't it? Because from the point of view of the listener, at the time, I'm sure, and certainly now with hindsight, listening back to these, you would never have known that. When you think of the leap in terms of stylistically and in confidence between the first record and Virus Meadow, it's very, very evident there that the sound of those two records, the leap between them, feel as far away from the way you, the musicians, were feeling as it could possibly be, really. In terms of you're up to I think it's part 27, isn't it, of the biography that you've written that's just come out, or at the date of this recording it's just come out. Has there been any discussion between Justin and yourself to carry this on past the point that you're at now?
Yeah, I don't quite know how far I'm going to go. My initial thought was that I'll take it to the end of the 80s and then see how I feel. There's a lot of people saying you must write a book. And I'm thinking, well, yeah, okay, that would be lovely. But I'll probably have to go back and rewrite some of the earlier ones, which I wrote in more of a hurry, but that's okay. And
I was just going to ask you that.
I'm already involved with another book project, which is going to be another lyric book.
Oh.
I'm talking to a Dutch fella at the moment who wants to get a book, my lyrics published.
Wonderful.
So that's my next book, lyrics and photographs.
Yes, now that you mention this, actually, I think I have read this before. So this is going to be, and also the Trees lyrics, with your photographs in the book.
Yeah.
Right, okay, that's brilliant. Now, we've kind of ended up here, so I will just ask you, obviously there's the reissues that have come out of the first two records and the evening of the 24th live album, Expanded. What was the impetus behind re-releasing those? Was it a sense of kind of reclaiming your legacy now that you've got your own label?
It wasn't that. No, it was. I think it was they had just become unavailable. There was no vinyl. We didn't have any vinyl copies left for a long time.
Yeah.
The CDs were sort of tacky pearl plastic CDs.
They were the ones
not
I
very
had.
well. The sound. I don't think the mastering had been done particularly carefully. I don't know, but we thought it would be very nice to sort of do a little bit of work and represent them, sounding good with some nice artwork and some extra tracks.
Yeah, I mean, and they really are beautiful. And the thing that struck me immediately was the quality of the remastering. These things sound brilliant. The dynamic range is probably the best I've heard these songs presented, because I grew up in the CD age just before the vinyl revival happened. So I had those original jewel cases.
I was surprised because I haven't. I've always thought that I haven't got a particularly good ear. I thought people were exaggerating when they were talking about the sound of vinyl being better than CD. I thought, I don't think I can tell the difference. But actually, the first time I ever could tell a difference was when I could compare the new CD, the remastered CD, with the vinyl remastered, not the old, but the new, so the same, but just on different formats. And I could tell the difference immediately, that the vinyl has got a warmer, different feel to it. I mean, you wouldn't know if you just play the CD, it sounds great. You don't question it. But if you put the vinyl on, it does have a different feel, and I could hear it.
Yeah, I agree. And I think, you know, sound quality aside, it's just great to have these remasters, these reissues presented in this way, sounding this way for people to enjoy. And I think particularly it's really benefited the first record with that gorgeous cover, which Nick took that.
He did, yeah.
Yeah, I thought so. The photo is cleared up really beautifully, and I think the colours really pop on the reissue. You mentioned before how much you've enjoyed and were surprised how much you enjoyed listening to the first album again. Were there any tracks that stood out, or what was it for you?
I don't think it was tracks particularly. I think it was the overall production was very good, and I hadn't thought about that or really listened to that for a long time. And the general performances were good. I was expecting it to sound a little bit. I was expecting to listen back and to feel slightly embarrassed, because I was imagining that I was going to sound over emotional and young. Yeah, I sound young and a bit emotional, but that's not a problem for me now. I took it for what it was, and I just thought it was a well crafted and well produced record.
Yeah, and Lol Tolhurst's production on this album is really brilliant. And something that struck me listening back to it with the remasters is that you can hear everything. Every instrument has space to do its thing. And I don't think that's something you could say for some records from this period.
No.
And of course, included in these sets, you've got numerous demos and extra tracks, particularly on the debut, but on Virus Meadow as well. There's some EP tracks on there. When you listen back to, I think it's very easy with hindsight to listen to demos almost in a vacuum. How do you hear them now? Do you hear them in that way, or do you hear those hours in the rehearsal room, working out little nuances that kind of evolved as the song evolved? How do you hear them?
I hear them as time capsules, I think. I was surprised to hear our very early demos. My voice surprised me, because on our very early demos, I still had my West Midlands accent, which I lost, which I worked out. I worked my way out of that after that, because I thought it didn't sound right with the kind of music. So, it was quite nice to hear that.
Sure, yes. I was playing them earlier, and there was something, and there's something about Simon's voice. What is it? That's it. Are there plans for more issues? Going to take this campaign further, do you think?
We'd like to remaster Listen for the Rag and Bone Man.
Oh, yeah.
Because it was never released on vinyl, and we like that album a lot. And Justin's talking about the Mill Pond Ears at the moment, so we'll see.
And of course, these 40th anniversary celebration releases kind of culminate really in the Slow Pulse Boys documentary with FD Films, Faye Diver, who you've had a long-standing relationship with. Whose idea was it to do this? And who broached the idea of doing a career-spanning documentary with you? Because that's quite a feat for anyone to do.
He did, Sebastian. He wanted to do it. Alexander had been working on a biography of one of the trees and has been for a long time now. And I don't know if he's still planning on a book or whether he's shifted over to the film. We Justin and I weren't particularly sure that we liked the idea at all. It's going to be getting the balance right so we don't demystify the band too much, because there's something nice about the mystery of the band and all bands.
Sure. I am one of those people too, actually. I think it's very, very easy to demystify your art. And I think, in a naive sort of way, that sense of separation is almost part of it as an audience member. And obviously there's huge pressure now to demystify, to be closer, and break down those barriers, I guess.
Yeah. This was why we weren't sure about it. And I suppose in a way it's partly why I've been writing these pieces about the band. I can be in total control of that. But at the same time, I feel like I have to get involved a little bit in seeing how it's progressing, because he's putting so much time and effort into something. It's absolutely humbling that anyone could be that interested in what we have been doing, which is great.
Yeah, of course. And did Sebastian kind of come to you with an idea of what he wanted to do? Did he come up with a storyboard or anything like that? Because there is a tendency with career-spanning documentaries on artists to focus very, very heavily on one specific period, the early years, and then sort of brush over everything else.
Yeah. No, he didn't come forward with a storyboard. No, not really. And I don't know when he's going to stop it, because the problem with this is that we're still going. We used to joke with Alexander, because Alexander started to write the biography of Unorse the Trees about 10 years ago. And Justin said at a certain point, he's waiting for one of us to die, preferably in sordid circumstances, or he finishes and releases the book, publishes the book. But I mean, and that can't be the case with Sebastian, because he's sort of promised that it's going to come out this year or early next year.
Yeah, and you've sort of answered this already, but the two trailers that have come out, and I'll link these in the description, the cinematography and the production is just so lavish, and you can tell the amount of care and love that's been put into it, which must be really gratifying for you guys. It feels like Sebastian really understands the tone of the band and knows who you are.
I think he does, yeah. We're a band that have always had sort of complete control over everything, over our artwork, over when we work, what we do. We're not very easily managed. We manage ourselves. And this is a rare occasion when things are not completely in our control. And I think Justin and I are a little bit edgy about it.
Of course, yes. And I mean, as being quite private individuals as you are, that's understandable. And when you've been looking at your career as a whole for the documentary, as opposed to in small pockets of time like you have for the web articles or liner notes, for example, does that make you appreciate the journey you've kind of been on in a different way? Because you're almost stirring up two kinds of thought there.
Yeah. It's a bit dizzying, actually. I get a sort of time vertigo effect when I think about it. It's so far back and so many things have happened. And I think at the moment I'm surprised at how despondent and unhappy we were at a period that was effectively perhaps our most not successful, but when we were getting a lot of limelight and a lot of things happening, compared to much later times when we were actually much happier as musicians and people doing what we were doing. I suppose it was letting go of that early, not obsession, but that early desire for what we thought was success at the time, which was, I suppose, Top of the Pops and the Old Grey Whistle Test and being on the front of the Enemy and all that kind of stuff that after a while stopped mattering to us.
Yeah, of course. I mean, that would matter, I think, to anybody initially when they started out, wouldn't it? Because those were a big deal then. I'd like to just briefly touch on with you your rural upbringing, or perhaps the countryside more broadly, and the influence of that. Because as somebody who grew up in a rural environment myself, I do think it shapes you in a slightly different way to the urban environment. I was the only person in my family to kind of grow up away from that. Everybody in my family grew up in London, and I was the only person, and still am the only person, to grow up in the countryside.
Okay.
Do you think it's fair to say that it shaped you in a different way?
I'm sure it did. Yes, Justin too. I mean, I'm naturally more in touch with nature than Justin is. I can very much hear the countryside and something very natural and organic in his guitar style and his way of composing music. I don't think he would have been composing and making music that sounded the way it sounds if he was brought up in an urban environment. And certainly my lyrics wouldn't be like my lyrics are if I was brought up in an urban environment.
There's a fantastic quote by E.M. Forster, which I've got here somewhere. Let me try and find it. Here we go. The English countryside, its growth and its destruction, is a genuine and tragic theme. And I love this line. And to kind of talk about your lyrics, were you aware growing up of the darkness, the sort of the undertow of the countryside and those horror stories?
Oh, absolutely. As children moving, you see, we moved there when I was 10 and Justin was 8 or 7. And of course, as children, the things that we were most fascinated in were the ghost stories and the darker side of the countryside, the creepy things. And so this was our first real thrill and excitement, really, of living in the countryside as children. So we sought out those stories from the locals and kind of grew up with them and then forgot them, kind of, or stopped thinking about them. But then they started to sort of come back into our minds again as we were searching for creative influences in the house that we were living in.
Where did literature come in for you then, as something more than just you did it at school?
This was just a chance thing for me, necessity. It was me standing in my brother's bedroom with the rest of the band playing a piece of music and me having no idea what I was supposed to sing about or talk about. So I went out of the bedroom to a cupboard, picked up a book and opened the book and started reading little bits from that book. It could have been any book. I didn't have any knowledge of literature, but luckily it was a book by Aldous Huxley called Time Must Have a Stop. This kind of sparked the whole thing off for me because having done that as a 19-year-old who had never read any literature outside of school and had little interest in it and no knowledge of it, I thought, well, I better read this book. I probably won't be able to understand it because it's like a grown-up book. But yeah, as you can tell, I didn't leave school with much self-confidence. But no, I read that and I thought, well, I kind of understand what this is about. And this is the moment when I started to understand literature. I know it sounds very, very naive and primitive, but that's how it all started with me. And once I'd read that book, Time Must Have a Stop, I started looking at more books by Huxley, and then I started going to bookshops. And it was like a whole new world opening up to me.
Sure, and I don't think that's naive at all. And I think to discover an author like Huxley at that age, when you're that impressionable, is a really powerful thing, because I don't think it's necessarily about understanding the meaning behind the words of an author like that, but the power behind them. And he was nothing if not a powerful and evocative writer.
Absolutely. Well put, yeah, exactly. And I was very lucky it was him and not someone like Nabokov, for example. He's a wonderful writer, I'm sure, but I absolutely can't get him at all. And that could have put me off literature forever.
I'm having flashbacks to university now, trying to hack my way appallingly through pale fire. When you read nowadays, particularly around the time of writing a new record, are you always reading with lyric writing in mind, or do you read for pleasure and it's just a case that it might spark an idea off?
Lyric writing is almost always in the back of my mind, if not the front of my mind and the middle of my mind as well. That's just what my life's been like for most of the time. So I choose carefully what I'm reading because I know that it's going to influence me, or I know that I'm going to be open to being influenced by it if I'm lucky. I will choose carefully what I read, and if I get something from it, then, which I very often do, then I'll be happy. Of course, in that period of time when we moved away from our roots and started taking influence from Americana and the Jazz Age. Of course, at that period, I was reading Scott Fitzgerald and Hemingway and the beat writers, knowing that and hoping that some of that would rub off on me in a not too obvious way.
Yes, of course. And I'd like to come back to those records, the 90s albums, a little bit later on. Angelfish in particular, which I love this record, and I think it saw you taking risks, taking chances when you could have very easily stayed on the path that you were on, and you didn't do that. You evolved, and I think you evolved to the betterment of the band, and that's kind of continued because those sounds are still in there now. But to kind of stay on this period for a minute, we talked about post-punk before, and you've documented in your articles really beautifully about discovering punk rock. But was there a sense, because of where you, Nick, Justin and Graham grew up, that you felt a little removed from that, or that it didn't necessarily represent who you were and how you felt?
Not really, strangely. It was the spirit of rebellion and the whole spirit of punk rock and the idea that you could just get up and give it a go. You didn't need to be an accomplished musician at all. And it was wrapped up in this sort of, in the emotion, the confusion of this transition from childhood from adolescence to adulthood that we all went through. Some of us, I mean, Graham and I suffered more than Justin and Nick. And I think that is what the spirit of punk rock was appealing to. And it wasn't so much about the environment. I think there were times when we felt we would have liked to have been in Birmingham. We would have liked to have been hanging out in the urban streets of Birmingham and going to clubs and pubs and gigs there rather than being stuck out in the sticks and walking around pear orchards or whatever, which we were doing, which was marvelous and we loved it. But there was a sense of frustration there as well. We wanted to be closer to the heartbeat.
Sure. And I think the countryside, for all its upsides, can also, that solitude can soon turn to isolation, can't it? But then you've mentioned that you quite often need to work in isolation when composing lyrics and working on melodies and so on. Has that always been the case for you, or is that?
Pretty much. In fact, exclusively, yes. I'm not good at working when anyone else is around. I need to be settled and quiet and sober and alone and free, yeah.
And in terms of the music, is it a case that Justin will put something together with Paul or whoever else you are playing with in the band at that time, give you the track, and then that will suggest something to you?
Yeah, almost exclusively Justin on his own, although we're going to change that for the next release. But I mean, very often it's just Justin coming up with guitar sketches and pieces that I will then listen to and try and find something within them, which I often can, but not always.
I think the impact of Justin's guitar style on the band can't be overstated, and it's something, because it is unique, and I would like to see him more widely respected for that mandolin balalaika sound. And then obviously in the 90s he would add new elements into that, change his sound a little bit, bring in the sort of twangy surf influence a little, and the jazz age use of chords. But that mandolin balalaika sound, I think he's managed to bring that back and actually marry these disparate elements together. That sound, though, it just seemed to come out of nowhere when you listen to the records. Was he working on that around the time of the first album, but just didn't use it?
Not the first record. With the first record, he just had a thing about his guitar not sounding like a guitar. That was what he wanted. He was trying to make it sound different for the first album. Well, he told me recently, actually, because I'd forgotten, but I think the first time he came across that style of playing, which comes naturally to him, but not to many other people.
It's very difficult to emulate, because I have tried and continue to do so.
Apparently, yes. There was a man of double D, apparently.
Oh, really?
I didn't realise that, but I think there's an overdubbed guitar.
Yes, there is.
Which he thought of when we were all horrendously hungover, recording irresponsibly recording the Arumlas in Lucy CD, not CD, 12-inch. That's when he first came across that style of playing. And then he sort of went back to it for the certain songs in Virus Meadow.
Yeah, and the reason I mentioned before that was he experimenting with it around the time of the debut. As I just mentioned, when you listen to A Room Lives in Lucy and hear that sound and then Virus Meadow and on, it really feels as if it was just there, seemingly fully formed. When you heard that and he incorporated that, was there a sense that the band was finding its identity?
Yes, I think this happened at the same time as, I think a few things happened. I'm just thinking it now, actually, because I haven't got that far in my writing. Thinking about it now, I think there are a few things that happened at the same time. There was Justin's guitar style, as you say, this sort of the balalaika, mandolin style. That happened. The realization on my part that what I had to write about was what I could see from my window and what was surrounding me in the English countryside, and drifting backwards and forwards from the past and to the present, as without limiting myself how far I went back and whether it was even in the same song. I could move out of time and back if I wanted to, which was a discovery for me. And our style of dress. Back then, I got a feeling that the image of bands was more important back then than it was at other periods. And bands wanted to have an image. And I think through punk and realizing and getting interested in style, we wanted to find a way of dressing in a style that was different. And through going to jumble sales, partly out of the need because we couldn't afford to buy new clothes, we discovered things like frock coats. And I remember coming across these suede coats, must have come into fashion for women in the 60s, that fitted me if I could let the sleeves down. Because I was young and still slender, my shoulders were thinner in those days, I could get into these coats and they looked stylish in that sort of, I fancied that I looked a little bit like someone from a period, Thomas Hardy era period drama or a spaghetti western or something. So that image, which people relate to the sort of romantic period, happened at the same time. So it was those three things that happened all at once, which molded the band's future, really.
That's really interesting, and actually leads me quite nicely into what I wanted to ask you next, because obviously the musical landscape has changed in many, many ways that probably would never have been predicted back then. But also other factors at play, the distance between band members, people having families, lives changing. What drives you creatively now? What keeps you going with it?
I suppose it's the curiosity of wanting to know where and also the trees that are going to go next.
Yeah.
We don't know. And I think we still have that spirit of fascination or excitement about where we can go or where we will go. And I want to know what happens next. I also want, I suppose Justin's the same, we just get a great pleasure and fulfillment from creating something that we think is at least interesting and we hope kind of unique and that will bring something to other people, but also sense of satisfaction of just making something that we think is interesting.
Absolutely. And I think that drive that you feel is felt in turn by the audience. And I think the Trees audience really believes that in you. It's funny, I was talking about definitions of punk rock in the first episode I did of this with Bob Short from a band called Blood and Roses. And he was talking about punk just being having a dumb idea and doing it purely for love, irrespective and in some ways the antithesis of the image of punk, which really doesn't matter.
Yeah. Yes, I agree.
You've obviously been releasing records under your own label for a while now. We mentioned before that the musical landscape has changed, the business of music has changed, but you're sort of used to doing things under your own steam, as you've already said. But there are logistical factors at play that wouldn't have been at play back then. How have you handled that, or how have you found those logistical changes and handling the business of being a band?
What, from when we first started releasing our own records, or from?
Yes, that's right. Yeah.
Justin is really the guy that's in control of that, with that side of things.
Right.
It's a bit of a curse on him, but yeah, it's tricky. It's difficult to know. Sure, yeah. Brexit now has made things even more difficult because of the postage and the customs and all this stuff that's worked against us. And of course, touring now is more difficult as well because of this non-freedom of movement, which is all very annoying. Of course, the digital revolution changed things massively. It's difficult to sort of bring the whole thing together and make a comment about it because, of course, a lot happened over quite a long period of time.
Yeah, I mean, we could go back and forth, and I have gone back and forth on the benefits, the positives and the negatives of digital, whether it be social media or streaming platforms, and on and on. But I think for a band like The Trees, where you are used to doing things your way, for want of a better phrase, I suppose, I can see that it's really benefited you because it allows you, like with the web articles that you've been writing, it allows you to stay in touch with your audience without being quite so literal about it. So while you're not telling people what you've had for dinner, you're able to give something back to them and kind of break that barrier down a little bit and make it freer.
Yeah, I think the demise of the music press, especially in the UK, and I suppose the demise to a degree as well of media in general, has worked, I think, in favour of underground bands like ourselves. It's not a closed shop anymore. As you say, we can put stuff out, we can put flyers out, we can write stuff, and it can reach 1,000 people the way we want it to if the people are receptive and want that information, which is a huge benefit because being on the right side of the media in the UK was something that we never had the advantage of. I'm not particularly bitter about it because I think it's simply a logistical thing. We were up in Worcestershire, so was our record company. We didn't know people in the music business. I didn't realise how important that was until I went to places abroad and went out with friends in bands. And they would go into a bar and say, "Hi, I'll introduce you to this guy. He's a guitarist, and that guy over there, he writes novels, and he's a journalist, and this person works at the radio." And they all know each other. See, we didn't know anybody, and I think this was a handicap. Back in the 80s and 90s, that was so important. And I think nowadays, with the internet, bands are a lot freer.
Yes, and I think that's the one positive it's irrefutable, the freedom. To step away from music for a second, I'd like to touch on your photography because, as we've said before, you do take photographs. You've taken photographs for the band, and you worked as a professional photographer before the band. Is that right? And how did that come into your life?
I was only a professional photographer for 3 or 4 years when I was just before we were forming the band. I still take photographs and I still exhibit photographs, but I'm not a professional these days.
Not professional these days, but still exhibiting. And you took the Bone Carver cover shot, is that right?
Just into the artwork, they're my photographs, yeah.
I think to go back to what we were discussing earlier, or what you mentioned earlier about the lyric book, including a selection of your photographs is a really wonderful way of kind of bringing those worlds together. Really, really appealing idea. Do you think photography and music come from different places within you creatively, or is there some overlap there? I'd love to get your thoughts on that.
I think there's a crossover. Justin said some years ago that in his opinion, we're artists that make music rather than musicians that make art.
Yeah, and I think an auditory or aural medium like music versus the visual and compositional elements of photography, obviously they are different, but I guess you could say there are similarities in terms of with photography, for example, whether you work in a dark room or with software, there is the need, a bit like composing music, for solitude and to be in your own space in the way that you would when you compose your lyrics. So I guess there's a bit of an overlap there as well.
Yeah, I think that there is also a similarity creatively in that it's very difficult to know. I don't have a formula for taking good photographs, and I don't have a formula for writing good lyrics. It's a very much instinctive thing that happens when it happens. I can't go out and say, I'm going to go and take some great photographs. I can take a load of photographs, but whether they're going to be any good or not is another question entirely.
Sure. Have you found that as you've grown, had a family and settled down, that it's changed your approach to creative endeavours at all?
Not really, no.
That's interesting. The reason I ask that is when you're younger, everything is moving so fast and it feels very breathless, and you almost don't want to stop doing things through fear of it, through fear of losing it. You're losing the muse, if you like. Whereas now that I'm older, I'm starting to feel that I actually need stability and clarity of mind in order to be creative, and that's something I really didn't think would happen.
Yeah, I'm the same. I agree. I think I'm a little bit less unbearable when things aren't going well than I used to be. I think my wife would tell you that. I hope my wife would tell you that.
I am sure she would. Um, let's talk about, because I'm really keen to get to talking about the modern era of the band. So let's talk about. I told you we'd jump all over the place here. Let's talk about the mid 90s and when you started to change the sound, because you'd already been experimenting with Green is the Sea and the Klaxon, which were 92 and 93 respectively. Just check my notes. Yep. What prompted that? Because when you listen to those albums, it feels like a very natural progression. But what prompted it?
What you mean, the Green is the Sea and the Klaxon albums?
Yes, I suppose the Klaxon more so, and obviously Angelfish is the big one in terms of the definite next chapter. But listening to the Klaxon again earlier today, there were breadcrumbs throughout that you were beginning to evolve.
Yes, exactly. I think we were edging towards something more urban and more modern, well, modernity rather than being with it. We were edging towards that. And then we took the plunge with Angelfish, or Justin did. A lot of it was to do with the fact that we were worried that, or we didn't like the idea of being typecast as a romantic pastoral band, which is basically the image that we created. A lot of people liked a lot, including us. But we didn't want to get stuck there. We needed to break out. I think Nick was one of the main factors here. He wanted to get away from that. He was more driven by a kind of jazz sound. And I think, being as he was sort of on the verge of wanting to leave the band forever, we kind of hoping to keep him in. And I'm very thankful to him for that edginess, because it did make us look for something else and get out of our comfort zone. Yes, it was finally Angelfish that when Justin changed his guitar sound, we did away with the balalaika mandolin style and brought in this twangy 1950s sort of Americana style, jazz age sort of vibe.
Talk to me a little bit about the jazz influence, because I can still hear that in what you do now. As far as I'm concerned, that's been there for a very, very long time. How did you discover that? Was it a case that you were always interested in and enjoyed listening to that? Or were you reaching out for influences in the 90s, you stumbled on jazz and then went from there?
The latter, as you just said. None of us are jazzers, so to speak. I know very little about jazz still, actually. But it was that period of discovery, the icons of jazz, if you like, the Miles Davis and John Coltrane, and the very obvious sides of jazz, which, of course, there's jazz and jazz and jazz. Only ever going to like parts of what we hear. Can't like it all. And trying to find the bits that you like was challenging and fun. Nick included. He didn't know a lot about jazz. We would find something suddenly, like Take 5, if you like, and think, wow, listen to that. We want more of that. So you buy a Brubeck album and there isn't really more of that gives you that feel, or gave us that feel. So it's quite elusive, but it did have an effect on us, and we were searching everywhere. We were discovering classical music at the same time, and medieval music.
Sure, you can hear traces of all of that from around this period, and it's funny talking about the jazz. As far back as Red Valentino on Green is the Sea, you can hear that there are elements of, for me, cool bop in there. That could be, I could imagine Dexter Gordon doing something like that. And to bring it back to Nick, the irony being he was gearing up to leave the band. Let's talk about his drumming for a second, because it seemed to me that he was very, very adaptive to that and was beginning to develop really quite naturally in that direction.
Yeah, I think there was a period when he would have liked to have been a drummer as a living, make a living from drumming, not just with the Trees, but to be I suppose like my friend Bernard Trontin, the Young Gods drummer, and is a brilliant drummer, but he has to play with a lot of other people as well to be able to get anything like a normal wage. There was a period when I think Nick would have liked to have focused more on his drumming, but that possibility never arose. And he basically, when he stopped playing with the Trees, he stopped drumming completely. Didn't get behind his drum kit again for like 25 years. I think in the last couple of years, he's set his drum kit up again. Got a feeling it was so because his daughter was interested briefly and then wasn't interested anymore. And then being as it was set up, he started drumming and discovered he really enjoyed it. And so I think he's drumming just for the pure pleasure of drumming now on his own.
That's really nice to hear, though.
Yeah.
You mentioned Bernard before. Tell me about November. How did you meet Bernard, and how did that project come together for these two records now?
I met Bernard when I first came to Geneva in 2000. I was in a record shop, the sort of underground independent record shop here in Geneva, and I was talking to the owner. He recognized me because he'd actually put the Trees on in Geneva years previously, so that was quite nice. And apparently what happened is that Bernard came in a week later and was already friends with this guy, and they started talking, and Bernard was saying he had a lot of music of his own that he'd got and didn't quite know what to do with. Some of it was ideas he'd written for the Young Gods, which had been rejected because they weren't Young Gods enough, and other bits for film soundtracks that he'd written that had been edited out, and other stuff that he'd just written for the joy of it on using keyboards and samples. And he said that what he would like to do would be to record an album with guest vocalists, Paul. And he said, and I'd like to ask the singer and also the Trees as well. And the guy said, that's weird. He came in the other day. He's living here now. So that's how that happened, which was nice. And he set up a meeting. And of course, Bernard was a big fan of The Cure back when he was a youngster. And when he saw our first album in a record shop with a piece of paper across the cover saying produced by Lol Tolhurst of The Cure, he bought the album and loved it and has been a fan since. So that was nice. We got together like that, and he gave me some pieces of music. The idea that I would write a vocal for one of them, but it just clicked, and I wrote some ideas for about 6 of them, and he liked all of them. So we thought, well, let's do the whole album, just the two of us. So we've done that, and that's an ongoing thing. We've done 2 albums now.
Yes, and both wonderful records. There is a November Bandcamp page, and I believe some of the physical copies are still available. So well worth checking those out if you've not heard them. I think Midnight Rain may be my favourite piece that you've written. Do you approach writing for November in the same way as the Trees, or is it a different process for you?
No, actually, it's very similar. It's just an instinctive reaction to the music and I lose myself in it.
Sure. I think instinct is a really important thing here, isn't it? We keep coming back to that. Are there any elements of working with Bernard that you maybe develop nuances that you then take back and apply to the Trees, or are they distinct for you?
I think it's a similar path with all music for me, and I've just been also working with a Belgian violinist called Catherine Grandorge, and she asked me to write some lyrics and vocals for a project that she had, and it's a similar thing. It was just an instinctive reaction. Yeah, actually, I'll be recording an album with her. We performed it live already, but I'll be doing an album with her.
Oh, wonderful. Really excited to hear that. Will that be available? How will that be available? Will it be through her website or yours? Or?
No, that's on her record company, and it'll be under her. It'll be under her name. She works with different people in the past.
Oh,
I was
brilliant.
quite surprised when the offer came. When she approached the band first and said that she had a project and would Simon Jones, the singer, be interested in getting involved. We looked up to see who she'd been working with, and their last album was with Iggy Pop.
Oh, wow.
I thought, okay.
Gosh, that's too difficult to turn down, I would imagine.
Absolutely, yeah. And no, she's a very talented person, and I'm happy to be involved with her as well. But I mean, going back to your original question, no, it's for me, it's an instinctive thing. I don't really take anything from the one project and bring it to another. It's just a reaction to the music.
I think this fits nicely with talking about the modern era of the Trees, because there's something Justin said in the trailer to the documentary that's really stuck with me about he's quite glad that, in a way, that people have come and gone, which means it's not just a straight road. I thought this was a very self-aware thing to say and interesting, because if you think every era of the band, people who have come in have brought a unique flavour and kind of coloured that period, whether it be Ema with their hammer dulcimer or Carlin with his woodwind playing. Is it a case that a record is dictated by that, or is it the other way around, where the direction is there and it's a case that these players colour a set direction, or the direction that's there in the first place?
The latter, I think. They're added as colours, and they can bring in new elements and twists that are unexpected for us and exciting. And Justin often listens to what Colin's doing and gets very excited because he's doing something that he would never have thought of doing. And this brings another element of joy and excitement into the whole process.
Yes, and that's the thread for me that's run through this whole modern era of the band, which I think you could say it started with Further From the Truth, but it became most evident for me with Listen for the Rag and Bone Man and On, which was a fantastic record, and I get the sense that it was a very successful record for you personally within the band. It felt, I could really feel that it was a rejuvenation of some kind. Would you say that?
Yeah, really. To me, it's like this is the rebirth of the band was with Further From the Truth, but really blossomed with the Rag and Bone Man.
Yes, absolutely. I agree. Why did it feel like that, do you think?
Not sure. Not sure if it was part of my growing up or whether it was just a different element in the band. I mean, I was very sad when Stephen had to leave, but when somebody new comes in, it brings something different. And
sure, and I think the other thing that we need to touch on here, the sort of wrinkle in the fabric, if you like, which to me is the kind of seed that would then blossom into the modern era, is the acoustic project with When the Rains Come and those unplugged performances that you gave around that time. You were performing in very different venues previously. What was the initial impetus for that, and how did that come to be?
The acoustic project?
Yes.
I suppose it was a combination of things.
Right.
The double bass was quite inspiring. We'd never worked with a double bass before, and I think that being as we were working with the dulcimer and double bass and an acoustic guitar, and then a guy in Paris who was been a long-time follower of the Trees, who had his own sort of setup for unplugged performances, asked us if we would be interested in playing acoustic on his roof. We took it as a challenge, and after one of the Paris shows, we had a night off and played on his roof, and it was a very liberating experience to not have to use electricity at all. And so we rewrote pieces without drums, actually, because another element was, although it was kind of more convenient not to have the drum kit because Paul was busy having to look after children. So this sort of presented an opportunity for the rest of us to do something different.
Did you then take influence from that when you did write electric music and you brought electric instruments back in? Was that a growing process for you?
Absolutely. It informed Hunter Not the Hunter greatly. I mean, we learned a lot from that acoustic project about space, about sound and arrangements. And I think it carried on to the Hunter Not the Hunted album.
I think the whole modern era of the Trees, particularly Hunter Not the Hunted and On, and as I said at the beginning, that is my favourite record that you've done. I'm really reminded of Talk's Laughing Stock and Spirit of Eden in that use of space.
That's interesting.
Yes, and I think it's not in a musical sense, but in that use of space of not necessarily as an instrument, but allowing each instrument room to breathe, not feeling the need to fill everything with something. There's a very elemental sound to these records, which I think you could say Spirit of Eden had as well.
Yeah, I mean, it's a big favourite album of ours. We didn't ever think that it was. I mean, but this does happen in life, of course.
Yeah,
You latch on to certain
yeah, of course.
performers or writers or composers, and just through listening to them, whether you like it or not, some of it rubs off on you, whether you want it to or not.
Yes, of course. And when I first heard When the Rains Come, I got the sense, and I still think this actually, that it was as pivotal as Angelfish was for you in the 90s in terms of a breaking down and rebuilding of the sound.
Yeah, yeah.
And you've worked with Matthew Devenish. Talk about Matthew, who has been with you as producer and engineer since Further From the Truth, 2003. So 20 years now. He did the Bone Carver with you last year. What is it about that relationship that worked so well for you, and how did you come to work with Matthew in the first place?
Good question, really. This just happened. It's partly geographic, actually. He was the understudy, actually, at a certain point of our original producer sound engineer, which was Richard Waghorn. He was his understudy, and then when things became difficult with Richard, for logistic reasons, really, the obvious person to turn to was Matt, who happened to be a fan of the band anyway, through living in Malvern, where our record company was and where he discovered the band. So we kind of knew him anyway. He's quite a dry person. He's not very liberal with his compliments. So you never quite know whether he's really enjoying what he's doing. But then later on, you find out he is greatly. He's just very focused on sound. But he's a good person to have, to work with. He's an extremely good sound engineer.
Yes, he really is. And he has a knack for creating such clarity in the instrumentation and giving everything a very elemental, natural sound to it. And then when you get to an album like Born Into the Waves, which to me sounds like a collection of love songs in all of love's forms, he produces this very yearning, every instrument yearns on that record. And to talk about the Bone Carver, first off, was there a kind of a conceptual idea behind the Bone Carver? Tell me about that record, how you recorded that.
You know, to be really honest, with a lot of these albums, and I think it's the same for probably a lot of artists and musicians, you think about this after you've done it.
Sure.
As a way of explaining what you've done and trying to understand it yourself.
Yeah.
And it didn't have that same. It was quite clear cut with Born Into the Waves. Justin gave me some pieces and said they're love stories, they're love songs from different parts of the world. So this was like a beginning. It didn't happen like that. There was nothing like that with the Bone Carver. What he did do, he gave each piece, which he often does, he gave each piece a title. And on a number of these pieces, I drew influence and ideas purely from the title that he gave me. And sometimes that title changed and you wouldn't know, but it was a starting point. And that's kind of how that album came about, really, with a lot of titles.
I think when I play the Bone Carver, I listened to it yesterday on the run-up to this. For me, it almost sounds like a rumination on what happens next in someone's life. That's what I get from that record.
Okay.
But almost as an observer in the third person. It's not your life.
Maybe. I think I'm still trying to understand it myself, get my head around in that way about talking about it. But
sure. I suppose at this point it's still very fresh, isn't it? And you've not had a chance to perhaps perform it and bed the songs in live as much. It's a bit of an obvious question, I suppose, but are there any highlights for you? Any particular pieces or musical highlights, moments on that record?
I really loved the clarinet intro to Book Burners, which is ironic because Colin doesn't like it at all. And he was very angry that we used his original improvised piece because he wanted to rewrite it. So we had a little bit of friction about that. But in the end, he's learned how to play it exactly. Unfortunately, it's not a song that works particularly well live. But
that's a real shame because it is wonderful as it is. Absolutely beautiful playing.
Yeah, but I think these are the kind of highlights I get. There are also lyrical highlights when I stumble across something very often, just when a lyric comes out that I'm very, very happy with, which is a highlight.
Of course, yeah. I'd like to start to wrap this up, Justin, because I'm conscious that I've taken up quite a lot of your time, and I'm so grateful for you doing this with me. So I just have a couple of closing questions, closing thoughts for you. The first is really, do you think being in a creative outlet with your brother, with a sibling, has shaped your relationship with Justin in a way that it might not have developed if you didn't have the trees together?
Absolutely. I mean, this has kept us together. It's kept us together, but it's also kept the band together. This is what when we're together, we talk about the band, we talk about music, we talk about creativity. It creates a kind of a closeness that is quite unusual, I think, between siblings.
I think it is, yeah. I think it is, yeah. I'm an only child, so I couldn't really say either way, but certainly people I know who have siblings, it's quite a rare phenomenon. I think you can really feel that and see that on stage, particularly, that there is that connection there between you. Do you then, when you're around other people who perhaps have siblings, do you notice the differences between you, or do they notice it in you too?
I never thought about it, really. I don't know. No, I'm not sure.
Last thing then, is there anything left for you that you would like to achieve creatively, either with the projects you're working on with the trees or something else, or just for yourself, purely on a hobby basis?
I suppose there must be, but I don't have a good answer for that one. Okay, I can say this. What I would really like would be that if somehow, and I don't know whether this can ever really happen, I would like somehow to be reaching more people of your age and younger, rather than kind of being stuck with our people that are our age, or our age meaning within the band. It's great that people have stayed with us, and this is a really important thing about Unorth the Trees. I'm hugely thankful for people for sticking with us for so long. But I get a little bit disappointed, not so much with our audience specifically, but when I go to see, for example, the Young Gods, who are from the same period as us, look around the room and there are not enough young people there. And it's not an ageist thing. It's just, I think people are missing out. Young people are missing out because they're discounting bands that are older, because they're probably older and think that it's not their thing. It should be about the music. And there's a lot in that music that would appeal to people of, okay, my children are really into what the Trees do, and they're very early 20s, and their friends who have come have really liked the band as well. So I think it's a slight frustration that we could be, and it's not thinking of sales or even people through the door. It's just, I feel a great feeling of satisfaction, for example, when my children's friends have come to see the band and have really enjoyed it. That somehow keeps the band alive to me.
Absolutely. And I think there's perhaps a bit of ageism in music listenership, which I think is beginning to change. I think, again, digital has really helped with that. There's a lot more of a tableau of influences for people to draw upon. And I am starting to notice younger people at shows of bands who have a majority older audience. And I think, just to leave it on this, the reason I asked you the question about did you feel punk bands didn't represent where you came from is because that's exactly how I felt. These urbane bands such as Joy Division, Bauhaus, Sisters of Mercy were bands I loved, and I was interested in this period and this style. But they weren't really communicating to me on the level of where I was in my life at that point. I grew up in the countryside, as I said. I came to And Also the Trees with the 2005 anthology, and from the moment I put that on, and it was with the second track, Scarlet Arch, this was what I needed to hear, because it brought those elements together. And that's what I find with other Trees fans that I've spoken to. There is a uniqueness there that keeps people coming back. And it's something that only a few bands, I believe, are ever able to sustain for a career as long as you have. The Church, probably my other favourite band, have done it I can't think of too many others. And you never meet a fair weather and also the trees fan. You know, they're in it for life, and I think that's really special.
That's a good thing to leave it on.
I think it is, yeah. I think it is. Thank you once again for your time, Simon. I really appreciate it. It's been a lot of fun talking to you this evening. Really, really good to go through this stuff in detail. I'm going to put this up on SoundCloud. I'm going to put it up on YouTube. If the Trees social media could share it when I post it, that'd be great. I'm going to email it to you ahead of time as well, just so you can have a quick listen, make sure you're happy with it.
Okay.
But other than that, we'll leave it there. Thank you once again, Simon. It's been a real pleasure talking to you. Enjoy the rest of your day.
I must say, you speak very well, and it's been a pleasure talking to you.
Oh, thank you ever so much. That really means a lot, Simon. Take care now.
You too. Bye.
Bye. Well, that was special. That was special. My sincere thanks to Simon for being on this episode, and to you for listening. It's difficult to explain how important and also the trees are to me and were as a teenager. My upbringing wasn't dissimilar to Simon and Justin's, actually. And to hear them made me realise it was possible to kind of trap this feeling of quiet solitude and seclusion within the form of music that I loved, which was post-punk. Do head over to andalsothetrees.co.uk, check out the remasters, and if you have the time and the inclination, please read Simon's excellent band biography chapters. They really are brilliant. The quote at the top of this episode was taken from E.B. White's Stuart Little. Yes, that's Stuart Little. Until next time, don't forget to like, subscribe, pin the tail on the donkey, smack the pony, share this around, all of that. Until next time, I'm Jay Cridford. This is New Musical Chairs. Thank you for listening.